Good afternoon. Appreciate you being here as we continue our study of the Sermon on the Mount. I received a letter a number of years ago that I've saved because I just love the way it was worded. I don't know if they still do this anymore, but this is a letter from Citizens State Bank in Clara City, Minnesota. I got it in 1991. I was in my 20s. I was pastoring my first church, and I got this letter, and it started this way. Dear Mr. Gabbert, even though we've never met, I may turn out to be one of the most important people in your life. All right, I'm hooked. He went on to introduce himself, gave his name and his title, and he special assistant, special vice president for special accounts at Citizens State Bank, Clara City, Minnesota. This letter was to inform me that I had successfully made it through the first two stages of the Reader's Digest sweepstakes. Dear Mr. Gabbert, Reader's Digest has advised us that you have come through both stages. Now get these tough two stages. Selection of names and issuance of entry documents. In other words, they printed my name off of the list and they sent this letter. Those are the first two stages, but I made it through. He said, and you will be guaranteed eligibility in the third stage prize drawing for the $5 million grand prize upon the prompt return of your documents. Goes on to say, invested wisely, that $5 million could ensure a worry-free life for the Gabbert family. Well, I'm still good. We're in. He says a financial plan could be developed to help ensure a life of leisure for you and your family. I've saved that for 30 years. Because it's just, when I run across it in my files occasionally, it's just a reminder of what the world defines as a worry-free life. There's no problem in the world that money won't solve. Win $5 million and you'll never have another care in the world. The problem with that is, if I believed it, which I don't think I did in my 20s, I certainly don't believe it in my 60s because my experience is that money really is incapable of bringing to us the things that we most deeply yearn for as human beings. That's why the next section of the Sermon on the Mount is so important. Remember, we're approaching this as a sermon, as a single presentation with a flow of thought. And we saw in the introduction, he captivated his audience by saying, let me tell you how to be happy. And then catching them off guard because all the things he said that will bring happiness, none of them fit into their expectations. And then he said, let me tell you what God wants from you. He wants you to make a difference in the whole world. And then we came to point one, which was basically, what does an authentic follower of Jesus, what does an authentic believer look like? And he used a series of illustrations. He had 6 negative illustrations, things that you should not do. And then he had 3 positive illustrations, things that you should do. But the commonality on both the negative and the positive was, don't live life at the level of the external or the surface. What's important is the things that you don't do, you should not do those because you have no desire in your heart to do those things. Because you follow Jesus and you're being transformed from the inside out. But by the same token, those things that you should do, likewise, those should be done out of the overflow of what God is doing in your heart, not as some sort of religious obligation or spiritual duty that you have to live up to. Now he's going to take us, he's going to continue the thought. He's described the essence of a true believer, an authentic disciple. And it is this person who lives a godly life as the overflow of a transformed heart. Okay? There's the definition. And he's going to say, now, how should this person then, from there, how do we live? Okay? Those illustrations are reminders of our motivation, what compels us to do the things that we do. But now he's going to say, so how does that kind of person actually live in the real world? See, one of the complaints about Christianity, always made by people who don't understand Christianity, is they say Christianity just doesn't work in the real world. I mean, a perfect example, even biblically speaking, you go to the letters of John, and John has one of the most unusual sentences in the New Testament when the old apostle, speaking to young men, he says, young men, calls them out, he says, remember to overcome evil with good. What? But that's not the way the world works. We have to fight fire with fire. We have to get down and get dirty. We have to grapple with the forces of darkness. Doesn't make sense. Overcome evil with good? It only makes sense when you go all the way back to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus speaking to John and his 11 compatriots at the very start of their adventure in following Jesus, when he said, let me tell you, you think this won't work in the real world because you think you understand how the real world works. But I'm telling you, we're gonna function as my followers according to a set of priorities, according to a perspective that will make the flaws built into the, quote, real world be put on display. And you're going to understand that the life I'm calling you to is a call to live by what is really the real world. The eyes that we see with faith tell us different things than the eyes that we see by sight. Now, yesterday we talked a little bit about perspective, but I found this note on perspective that I wanted to share with you. It says, a parent once described how her 3 children would respond to the discovery of a spider web in the garden. The first child would examine the web and wonder how the spider wove it. The second would worry excessively about where the spider was. And the third would exclaim, oh, look, a trampoline. There's only one spider web in the garden, only one reality, but how differently it can be perceived and understood. To the poet, a pearl is a teardrop of the sea or a drop of dew solidified. To the ladies, it is a jewel that they can wear on their finger, their neck, or their ear. To the chemist, a pearl is a mixture of phosphate and carbonate of lime with a little gelatin. To the naturalist, it is simply a morbid secretion of the organ that among certain bivalves produces mother of pearl. To a believer, a pearl is a marvel of God's creation. You see, perspective is critical to the whole process of living the Christian life. And the shift in perspective is what allows us to see what we're calling the crucified life, not as some sort of desperate attempt to keep a righteous God off our backs, but it is the way of real life. It's the way of experiencing what God meant when He created us and made us human beings, what He designed us to be. There's already a different perspective in the Sermon on the Mount. He's told us that To be happy, we need to be poor in spirit. We need to learn how to mourn. We need to accept our persecution. We need to pursue righteousness. He's told us that things like murder and adultery and dealing with our enemies and even our positive devotional practices, they're all insufficient on the face by their external behavior. They need to flow out of a heart that is filled with the pursuit of God. So now, in chapter 6, he's going to flow out of that, and he's going to talk about really personal finances, but much more than that. But these are verses, much like I said yesterday, we tend to dissect the Sermon on the Mount and teach it in little bits and pieces. I don't know how many financial planning sermons or giving sermons I've heard come out of the Sermon on the Mount, and it's true that the application of these verses can be applied to the financial aspects of life. But again, when we do that, we miss the flow of thought for the overall sermon, which is this. He's trying to get us using the illustration of earthly transactions because he understands those are the only things that we can sort of grasp, the only things that we can get our mind wrapped around. He has to speak in terms that we can make sense. But what he's teaching here is not financial advice. He's teaching how to shift your perspective so that you can see your relationship to God and how that plays out in all of the areas of life. You'll see on your outline that I've given you today, he wants us to live by by the two things that I've given you here: an unswerving loyalty to the King and an uncompromising trust in the Father. He's going to use money as the illustration. But he's not really teaching about money so much as he's teaching about trust. So much as he's teaching about the life of a disciple who says, this is just the way I handle my money, not because there's some sort of divine program to invest and get a return. This is the way I handle my money because I've learned my relationship with my Father and how that plays out practically in all of the aspects of my physical existence. So let's look at this heavenly perspective that reorients a disciple from merely conducting earthly transactions to functioning as a person who lives by kingdom values. We finished with verse 18 of chapter 6, so we'll pick up with verse 19. I want you to see the unswerving loyalty to the King that he lays out for us here. In verse 19, he says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Now that text makes for a great sermon on giving, but it makes for a better sermon on living by a whole new value system. So let's look at it this way. He's going to use earthly finances as a way for us to grasp this, but he starts by saying, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal." The beginning of this discussion is that we're told in human existence that we need to save. We need a rainy day fund. We need to have a safety net. We need to have retirement funds and all those kinds of things because we let that become the security that we yearn for. What he wants us to understand is material treasure by definition is transient. In the ancient world in particular, the typical aspects of wealth were clothes, foodstuffs, and precious metals, gold, silver, whatever. Now, the problem with those typical currencies is that they were so easily susceptible to destruction of all different kinds. He says, don't store up treasures that are susceptible to really both natural and human problems. In other words, he says, don't store things don't build a storehouse of things that will be destroyed by moths or by rust. You see, if clothing, if a collection of clothes made from the best materials is where the wealth had been sort of established, the smallest moth can be devastating to your retirement closet. By the same token, it was always difficult for precious metals to have much purity in the ancient world, and so it was not uncommon for things that were considered to be valuable to rust. But it's not only the natural decay that goes with the things of this world, but also there are human enemies. He said there are also thieves who break in and steal. There's a danger here anytime that you put your wealth into something that somebody else can take away from you. Natural wealth has both natural and human enemies. Now, you say, well, we don't really put our wealth in food and in clothing anymore. Yeah, but even the language that we use to talk about things is interesting. The word value is a big word when we talk about finances. We talk about the value of the dollar or the value of our stocks or sometimes even the value of our cars or the value of our home or the value of collectibles. That's my favorite, the collectibles. Has anybody ever actually gone to college on that Beanie Baby that they were given when they were born? You see, we put our hopes and dreams in the most unusual places. And yet, even we say, well, I would never trust, collectibles or clothing or food. I remember where I was in 2008 when the stock market just took a nosedive. And people were beside themselves. What had happened? Well, you could hear them. They say, well, the value of my portfolio dropped by 40%. So value, by definition, is a snapshot of what something appears to be worth at a particular moment in time. But you see, value is different from worth because something is not worth objectively the same thing at all time if its value goes up and down. Well, Pastor, I'm going to give some stock to the church, but I need to wait and I need to do it this way because the value is going up. I'm waiting for it to do this and that. Value is the term that we use, but value, we don't even think about it. Value is a word that describes just how uncertain the objective worth is of anything that we own. Well, I bought my house and it's going to appreciate and I'm going to sell it. That's great. Until the neighborhood goes south and all of a sudden your house quits appreciating. Well, now what's it worth? Okay, see, that's the question. We bought it expecting it to have value. But then we wake up one day and we go, okay, well, what's it worth? Well, it's only worth what somebody will give me for it. You see, my point is not that you shouldn't make wise investments. That's not Jesus' point. My point is the whole conversation about such things is inherently unstable because the things of this world, even when they have recognized value, that value is still susceptible to fluctuation and change. There's not anything that you can stash away in your closet that will be that safety net for you come what may. So, oh, Pastor, I've got gold buried in my backyard. Awesome. Well, what happens if the price of gold goes down? Or what happens if society breaks into pieces and gold, inflation goes up so much that even if you have $10,000 worth of gold, what if $10,000 worth of gold someday only buys you a lunch at McDonald's? You see, you have to be very careful where you plant all your hopes and dreams. Jesus wants us to understand that there's a perspective here that takes us in a different direction. Now understand, he's not prohibiting, he's not telling us not to save. He's not prohibiting adequate financial planning. Rather, he's making an argument against making the accumulation of material goods the central and primary focus of life. St. Augustine said it this way: why do you lay up where you may lose, and where if you do not lose, you cannot stay? There is another place to which God will remove you. Let what you have go before you, and fear not lest you lose it. God was the giver, and God will be the guard. When I was 18 years old, I went on my first international mission trip. I was a freshman in college, and we went to Panama and to Belize, two countries in Central America. And in Belize, we stayed in the home of some Southern Baptist missionaries there. His name, the man's name was Otis Brady. I'll never forget Otis Brady, because he would sit on the porch in the evenings with this small collection of college students, and he would hold court. He would answer our questions, and he would, in a sense, it was a group counseling session because we were all filled with the determination to do something incredible for God. And here was a missionary sort of on his way to retirement, and he just sat there and he just shared wisdom. And I remember he said something that all this many years later I've never forgotten. Talking about this kind of attitude about the things that this world has to offer. Otis Brady said this. He said, "Young man, never hold anything in your heart that you can hold in your hand." Now, I'm just going to leave that there, because that's going to be something that about 3 days from now, you're going to go, "Oh my stars, what an incredible perspective." And yet it wasn't original with Otis Brady. It's Jesus telling his disciples, don't allow the things that this world has to offer to become the focus of your heartbeat. Never hold in your hand, never hold in your heart something that you could hold in your hand. He says, instead, store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. Treasures stored in a place where there are no natural enemies, where there are no human threats, because the reason you should store things there is because where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now that's a fascinating sentence. I heard a pastor one time, it didn't dawn on me until I really paid attention to the text, but I heard a pastor one time tell his people in a sermon, he said, give your heart to Jesus and your money will follow. Now that sounds reasonable, but that's not what Jesus said. Jesus didn't say, where your heart goes, your money will follow. He said, where your money goes, your heart will follow. What he meant by that was, the place where you invest your resources is the place that captures your mind. It's the place that consumes your attention. Listen, I have some retirement accounts, and I don't know much about it because I intentionally don't follow them too closely. Because I've had friends who invested in this or that and this company and that company, and they bought stock in this company over here. And what they do, the next thing is they have to get a subscription to the Wall Street Journal because every day they've got to check the ups and downs of the company that they have money in. I don't want to give that kind of time to those things. But see, when I talk to people about giving to the church, it sounds reasonable to say if you just love Jesus, you'd give money. But what Jesus said is, if you'll risk a new perspective, if you'll take the chance that Jesus does in fact know what he's talking about, if you'll give graciously and generously to the cause of Christ, what happens is you'll find your heart following your resources. People love to give their attention and their effort to the same things they give their money to. Now, the reason this is an interesting passage is because remember what I've said. I could preach this as a means of getting you to give more money, and yet Jesus is simply talking in terms of things that we can understand, because what he wants us to do is he wants to get us to the place where we have this new perspective. Verse 24, he says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. When he says no one can serve two masters, the Greek word here for master suggests a slave owner who requires total allegiance. In the final analysis, he's saying one area of your life will be chosen for your priority attention, and any other areas of your life will be hated, if only by neglect. He's not suggesting that if you're consumed with money that you won't have any place at all for God, but it will be a secondary place. D.A. Carson said this in his commentary on Matthew. He said, it's not merely a question of ultimate rewards, it's much more than that. For the things we treasure actually govern our lives. What we value tugs at our minds and emotions. It consumes our time with planning, daydreaming, and effort to achieve. As Jesus puts it, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If a man wants above all else to make a lot of money, to buy an extravagant house, to ski in the Alps or sail in the Mediterranean, if he wants to head up his company or buy out his competitor, if he wants to build his reputation or achieve the next promotion, advance a political opinion or seek public office, if he wants any of those things more than everything else, he will ultimately be devoured by these goals, and the values of the kingdom will get squeezed out. He then goes on to say, notice that none of the goals I mentioned is intrinsically bad, but none is of ultimate value either. Therefore, any of them can become evil if it is valued as ultimate treasure and thereby usurps the place of the kingdom. That's the point. Jesus is not here trying to give financial advice. He's here using money because that is so often the thing that we focus on. And he said, you got to settle this issue of what part of your life will be the master. Because the master demands absolute loyalty. There's no room for two masters in the life of a disciple. Giving is usually seen as an issue of faithful management of resources. But Jesus takes it and makes it an opportunity to view the world from God's eyes. In fact, that's where these two verses are that I skipped over. Let's go back. Verses 19 and 20 and 21, he talks about storing up treasure in heaven. You know, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Verse 24, he says you can't serve two masters. Okay, you got to make a choice. But there are these two verses tucked in here that almost never even get noticed because they don't seem to fit the flow, and so you really have to grapple with them to understand, but I want to help you there. Verse 22, he says, the eye is the lamp of the body, so then if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Now let me explain the Greek language that is behind those two verses. He's talking about a good eye that sees light and a bad eye that sees darkness. But when you look at the meaning of the Greek words, we could change the language a little bit to make it clearer, I think. And we might say, in some translations, I think it's actually translated this way, a single eye or a double eye. Where this translation says, a good eye and a bad eye, the Greek actually communicates a single eye or a double eye. Now, remember the flow. Don't store on earth, but store in heaven, because your heart follows wherever you store your resources. And he's coming out of that, and he's going toward, you can't serve two masters. The argument of these two verses in the flow of that thought is this. The eye is the way our brain makes sense of the world around us. It's where we receive light. It's where we get input that our brain evaluates. Information comes to us through our eyes. If you've ever been cross-eyed, or if you've ever had double vision, one of the challenges of double vision is instead of getting accurate information because you can see something and you can process it, double vision, the image is always shifting on you. It's always fading in and out, and you're never quite sure what to make of it. You're never sure where to step. You ever walk down steps right after you've had your eyes dilated and the doctors, your eye doctors messed with you, and you got new glasses, and you're like, because you're not sure exactly where the step is. Your depth perception is off. In this sense, you have a double eye or a bad eye. What Jesus is doing is he's taking this conversation about serving multiple masters, and he's saying a disciple has to have an eye that takes in information and sees it correctly so he can evaluate that information, so that he understands what belongs to the things of the world and what belongs to the things of the Spirit. He understands the demands of an earthly master and the expectations of a spiritual father, of a king. And if you have a disciple's eye, you can make sense of the world, and you know where to step and how to walk. But see, if you got a foot in both worlds, if you're trying to have two masters, he says you're going to have double vision. And the next right step is always going to be a little uncertain. You're not quite sure where to put your foot. See, that's what these verses mean. He's simply saying, settling the issue of where your ultimate loyalty rests gives us the ability to evaluate all of the information around us on a daily basis and understand how to step, where to walk, because we know who our master is. There's a single measuring line, plumb line, by which everything can be evaluated. But a Christian that tries to keep a foot in both worlds, that tries to have two loyalties, that tries to serve two masters, Elijah in the Old Testament on Mount Carmel. There's a great verse in that chapter 18 in Kings about Elijah. And he steps up to the nation of Israel. They've just watched a whole day of the prophets of Baal dancing around and singing and praying and cutting themselves and trying to entice their fake gods to send fire out of heaven to consume a sacrifice. Well, now it's Elijah's turn. And he's about to step up and pray a simple prayer and ask God to show himself mighty. But before he does that, he comes to Israel. They're all circled around. They've been watching this show all day long. That dead sacrifice on the altar of Baal is no closer to being consumed than it was that morning when they put it there. And Elijah says to Israel, how long will you totter back and forth between two opinions? It's a Hebrew word that is usually used to describe a drunk who staggers and can't keep his direction. And he says, how long are you going to stagger back and forth between two gods? Make your decision. Baal hadn't shown up today. Elijah spent the entire day mocking these 800 prophets of Baal because nothing happened, despite all of their fanatical pleading and enticing for their God to send fire to consume the sacrifice. Nothing happened. Elijah said, I'm going to show you God. He's going to put himself on display here. But the day is only a success if you decide right now that you are through tottering back and forth between two gods. It's the same thing that Joshua said as they were approaching the conquest. They were completing the conquest of the promised land. And Joshua in chapter 24, he stands up and he says, if you want to go back to the gods of your fathers across the river back in Egypt, then you do that. But he said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You see, what Jesus is doing is he's coming in the New Testament and he's laying out a decision for his followers that's the same decision that's been laid out in front of the people of God in every generation. God is not a hobby. He's not a sideline. He's not something that we do just because we kind of enjoy being with the people. This business of a spiritual walk, of being an authentic follower of Jesus, man, this is an all-in or all-out kind of deal. I mean, the church in our generation, to use the language of John in the book of Revelation, the church in our generation is a Laodicean church. The angel said to the church in Laodicea, listen, just be hot or cold. I mean, take a stand. Decide. But I've got no use for people that are back and forth, that are lukewarm. We live in a lukewarm generation. And that's why churches are going through the motions. They maybe even have big crowds. But they're not changing the world. They're just spinning their wheels. Jesus is here in the middle section of this sermon. He's only talking about money because that's such an obvious way to evaluate where our perspective is, where our priorities are. That's our most common distraction. But the lesson here is not about money. The lesson here is you can only have loyalty to one master ultimately. An authentic disciple of Jesus Christ has settled the issue of who his master is going to be. And it shapes his perspective and the way he takes in information into his mind and how he assesses things. The reality is our heart does go where our money goes, but when you invest all of your money in the things of the world, your heart will be captured by this world. But when you put your money in the work of God, your heart is captivated by the things of God. That's why giving is so important. Man, pastors take a beating because I've heard people say, well, you know, every time I go to church, the pastor's talking about giving money. I don't preach on money a great deal, but I always am aware that when I stand up to preach a sermon on giving, I know somebody is in this room for the very first time. And they're going, I knew it. But here's why it's important for me to teach on giving. Not because I'm trying to build a kingdom here, not because I'm trying to pay off a building, not because I need more money. It's not about the money. The reason it's important to teach about money is because giving is the tangible way we declare who's in control of our lives. Because giving money away is not a humanly natural activity. In fact, it makes no sense. If evolution is true, if we are just the successful survivors of a survival of the fittest mentality, then giving away what I have accumulated to help other people who maybe have less skills, that diminishes my ability to advance. It's silliness on the surface of it. But for a Christian with good eyes who take in information and assess it in the clarity of a single loyalty, we look at giving and we find out that giving is the very way we protect ourselves from the claims of the world on our lives. Money wants to be your master. The devil wants you to be so tied to this physical reality that your mind never wanders into the things of heaven. And when I give money away, when I write a check, when I do it online, when I give money to the church, my bank balance goes down, and it's a moment where I go, whew, God, I'm trusting you. How many times have you written a check to the church and thought, man, I could really use that money? You could. 100% of the time, you could. But it is a statement that you're making that God is going to call the shots and you trust Him. In the Old Testament, Israel was rigid about maintaining the Sabbath day. Now, obviously, that was one of the 10 Commandments, but they were rigid about that. Why was maintaining the Sabbath such a big deal? Because you see, the cultures around Israel, they believed that they had to make their own ends meet. They had to provide for themselves. They had to work hard, nose to the grindstone. They had to take care of their family. They had to get what was necessary to survive. So they worked 7 days a week. The reason the Sabbath was so critical to their testimony was the nations around went, what do you mean you take a day off every week? That's absurd. How do you get your crops in? How do you make a living? How do you have enough for your family? And the answer 100% of the time was, because I don't pay my bills. I serve a God who takes care of me, who provides for my needs, who offers provision for my care. And taking the day off is my public testimony that I believe in someone greater than myself who's responsible for seeing to my well-being. The same way that giving money is a statement of my testimony that I believe that the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills has enough resources and is favorably inclined to me as his child that he will take care of me. Pastor, you don't understand my bills. I don't have enough money to give to the church. You don't have enough faith to trust God with your life. That's what it comes down to. Giving away money is a statement that if God doesn't show up, I'm going to crash and burn. I admit that 100%. But if God doesn't show up and I crash and burn, I'm going down with God. Because those are my choices. I mean, what's my alternative? I could study and invest and strategize and do everything, and what happens? I'm going to leave it with the Beanie Babies to my kids anyway. What's a better strategy here? It is an unswerving loyalty to the King. Well, look where he's going to take us. He flows from this demand for loyalty to this call for trust. It's not just loyalty, it's a loyalty based on a trust because God has proven himself to be trustworthy. And he talks about anxiety here, but really the key word in the next section is the word worry. It shows up 6 times in these closing verses of chapter 6. Look at verse 25. I want you to see, I've outlined this passage on your outline. Anxiety is contrary to nature. Verse 25. For this reason, meaning you can't serve both God and money. For this reason, I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is life not more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the sky, that they do not sow nor reap nor gather crops into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more important than they? And which of you by worrying can add a single day to his lifespan? And why are you worried about clothing? Notice how the lilies of the field grow. They do not labor, nor do they spin thread for cloth. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? He starts by saying, for this reason, or therefore, because you can't serve 2 masters, because transient earthly treasures do not satisfy and do not last, because moral and spiritual vision is easily distorted and darkened when we have split loyalties, because a choice must be made between God and money, because the kingdom of God demands unswerving allegiance to its values, therefore, don't worry about mere things. It's contrary to nature. Jesus has been minimizing the ultimate importance of material possessions, and there are some who would listen to this and they go, so you're saying turn my back on wealth? Easy enough if you're rich, but I have children and a wife to provide for. What is he saying to me? Well, here's the thing. Obsession with money plays out in 2 opposite but equal extremes. If you have a lot of money, the temptation is greed because it consumes you. John Rockefeller was the one who, in answer to a reporter's question one day, when John Rockefeller was at that time the wealthiest man on earth, a reporter said, Mr. Rockefeller, how much money does a man need? And his answer was $1 more than he has. You see, if you have lots of money, the temptation is greed. You become consumed with money. But what if you don't have any money? If you don't have any money, guess what you're consumed with? Money. Why? Because while having lots of money produces greed, not having lots of money produces fear and anxiety. And guess what? The devil doesn't care which end you live at. He just wants you to not live in the present, because in the moment is where we meet Jesus. See, here's the thing. Remember the prayer yesterday? We didn't spend a lot of time on the disciples' prayer, but remember he says, give us this day our daily bread. What's fascinating about that prayer is that God promises to meet with us in the moment for our daily provision. But you know what he doesn't promise us? He doesn't promise us freedom from anxiety about what might happen next week. But what happens is, whether we have a lot of money or we don't have enough money at all, we find ourselves living in the future, scarred by anxiety because, well, what if such and such happens? He never said, I'll give you peace about what's down the road. He said, I'll give you peace when you meet me in the moment. See, what happens is every day has enough trouble to itself. And instead of resting in the presence of a Savior, we take the possibilities, the anxiety-filled possibilities of the future, and we try and drag those into the present, and it steals the joy from today. I just had a conversation a short time ago from somebody. We were talking, and I was trying to encourage them to just spend some time in the Lord's presence in prayer. I said, just let him give you the confidence that he's in control. And they said, well, but Pastor, what if such and such happens? I said, yeah, what if it doesn't? I heard a pastor say one time that he had a lady in his church, and she walked up after he'd preached on worry, and she said, Pastor, I want to tell you, you said worry doesn't work. I'm telling you worry does work, because 99% of the things I've worried about in my life never happened to me. Exactly. What worry and anxiety does is it steals the joy of today by living in the fear of what might happen tomorrow. Jesus is suggesting that in the same way that earthly possessions can become an idol which deposes God by becoming disproportionately important to us, so also our earthly needs can become a source of worry which also deposes God by fostering distrust. Jesus says, look at the birds and the flowers. Certainly you mean more to the Father than those things. Look how beautiful he makes the grasses that go into the fire. In fact, I love this verse. He says, is life not more than food and the body more than clothing? What does he mean? Jesus is saying the Father has already given you life. Won't he give you clothing, which is the lesser need? He's already given you the body. Won't he give you the food, which is the lesser need? In other words, we're zeroed in on what we might not have, rather than that shift of perspective, which is loyalty to God and uncompromising trust of the Father, to say, let me examine what I do have, what he's already done for me. You know that old hymn that we used to sing, count your blessings, name them one by one? Honestly, kind of a cheesy song. I never really liked that melody. It kind of just grates on me. But I'm telling you, you can't go wrong with the message of that hymn. Count your blessings, name them one by one. You know what inventorying your blessings does? It puts your fears in their place. I'm 62 years old. The devil wants me to think that I got here through 62 years of accidental events, but for some reason God is not sufficient to get me through tomorrow. The reality of my testimony is God's track record is pretty darn solid. Quit looking at the potential issues of the future and remember who it is we trust. There's a book by Steve Brown called No More Mr. Nice Guy. Kind of a mediocre book, but there's one awesome quote that I took away from that book. He said in that book, did you know that studies have shown it is almost impossible to give a dog an ulcer? You want to know why? Because dogs hardly ever try to be anything else but a dog. You know what your excessive anxiety and fear for the future is? It is your frustrating attempt to be God. How about if you just be a man, be a woman, a child of God? How about if you say, I'm going to have an unswerving loyalty to the King? And even better than that, I'm going to have an uncompromising trust of my Father. Well, When we lack that trust in God, it's not only an affront to Him, but it's also essentially a pagan lifestyle for us. In we left off at verse 30. Look at verse 31. He says, "Do not worry then, saying, what are we to eat, or what are we to drink, or what are we to wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be provided to you." In other words, he says, we're to, when we let worry and fear direct our steps, we're living life like secular man. We're saying that we worry. If we worry the same way that the pagans do, it's transparent that we're first of all pursuing the same things that they are, which is a denial of God's kingdom. But secondly, worry is the denial of our profession of faith in God, since He says here the Father is well aware of our needs, and our conduct is advertising loudly that we don't believe it. The disciple of Jesus must be concerned to have a distinctive lifestyle characterized by values and perspectives so unpagan that his conduct and his life, as it were, should be stamped with the words, "Made in the kingdom of God." Mickey Rivers was a center fielder for most of his career for the New York Yankees, but he also played for a short time for the Texas Rangers. I don't know if you know who Mickey Rivers is. He was just kind of a skinny, gangly, kind of a goofy fella. But he was just laid back. I mean, he just was always a good presence in the dugout. He kept tension down. He would just tease people. He was just a good guy. And a reporter asked him one time. He said, "Mickey, you're always you just kind of go with the flow. I mean, nothing seems to ever, tie you up in knots. How do you explain that?" And I want to read this exactly because it's worded so perfectly. He gave his philosophy of life, and this is what he said. "The way I see it, ain't no sense worrying about things you got control over, because if you got control over them, ain't no sense worrying. And there ain't no sense worrying about things you got no control over, because if you got no control over them, ain't no sense worrying." There's something to be said for the fact that if we can control something, then get to work. If you can't control something, then leave it in the hands of somebody that can. Worry is never our calling. Worry tells the world that we're just as stressed out about things as they are. So the logical conclusion is, what good does your God do you? We can't be just like the rest of the world. There's a perspective here. Unswerving loyalty, uncompromising trust. It's a perspective that is achieved only when we fix our attention, when we allow our thoughts to be dominated, when our mind's eye becomes consumed with one thing: following the Master and living by His words. There is a Chuck Swindoll story that he tells about a king named Tigranes. He was a king in Armenia back during the days of the Roman Empire, and the empire, expanding its borders, moved into Armenia and took the king captive. It says, standing before the conquering Roman general, waiting for the death sentence to be passed, Tigranes fell upon his knees before the general and pleaded for his family. "Do with me what you like," he said, "but I beg you to spare my family." The general agreed to spare all of them, and as he left, Tigranes turned to his wife and said, "What did you think about the general?" And she replied, "I never saw him." "What do you mean you never saw him?" Tigranes said. "You were standing within a few feet of him. You couldn't help but see him. What were you looking at?" With tears sparkling in her eyes, the queen gently replied to her husband, I saw no one but you. My eyes could only see the one who was willing to die for me. What if from the time we got up in the morning till the time we put our heads on the pillow at night, what if, to use the language of the author of Hebrews, what if we run the race with our eyes fixed on the one who was willing to die for us? What Jesus wanted these new disciples to understand is they didn't know everything yet that was going to unfold. They didn't know how this story was going to play out. But they would look back on the Sermon on the Mount and they would have this thought: if he was willing to die to secure my forgiveness of sin, what else could there possibly be that could even compare to that? If he would do that, won't he do all the rest of the things that I need just by definition of who he is? Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom of heaven. Pursue his righteousness. And all the things necessary to this physical life, those come. But when we pursue those things at the expense of the kingdom, what we find is we not only don't get the kingdom, but we don't get to keep all that stuff. It's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of loyalty and trust. What does a disciple look like? He looks like someone who acts both in what he chooses not to do and in what he chooses to do. He acts out of the overflow of a transformed heart, not external rules and regulations. And how does that same disciple live his life? With his eyes fixed on Jesus, knowing that his life is in the hands of a Father who has decided for his name's sake to take care of us. See, when it comes to money, I don't pay my bills. God does. See, I just talked to God this morning about that. My wife had a kidney stone over Christmas. Just got the doctor's bills, the hospital bills. Outrageous. I said, Lord, I don't have this money just lying around here. And just as I was beginning to think, how am I going to do this? What am I going to do? I had to go get ready to teach Matthew chapter 6. And it's like the Spirit said, Gabbert, are you paying attention? Don't teach something that you're not willing to live by. So, let us declare our loyalty, let us live our trust, and let us view everything that God has called us to do as a privilege that comes with being the people of God. Point 3, and the invitation tomorrow. Father, thank you so much for your word. This passage is sweet to our ears. It encourages us. It reminds us of things that we often forget because we get caught up in the demands and the preoccupations of the world as it passes around us. Father, teach us the discipline of keeping our eyes on Jesus. We still live in this world, but we are not of this world. We are not made by the things of this world. Find here a people whose hearts are pure, whose hearts are wholly committed to you, and help us to be uncompromising followers of Jesus Christ with pure hearts. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.